Kneel in reverence before Hippowdon Corleone, the godfather of defensive Sandstorm. Neither fellow Sandbringer Tyranitar nor fellow Gen 4 mafiosi Honchcrow could live up to this mighty hippo's towering defensive prowess. It cast a monstrous shadow that loomed over all and wore down any would-be usurpers, 6.25% at a time. The heavyweight Pokemon is a colossal sand-soaked monolith, its design drawing inspiration from the legendary Bahamut itself. As soon as you came across Elite Four Bertha's Hippowdon in Diamond, Pearl, or Platinum, you knew you were dealing with a true behemoth of bulk. Today, we are honored to examine Hippowdon's rich history in the competitive scene. And so, we ask, how good was Hippowdon actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Hippowdon instantly made its mark in its debut generation's OU as one of the purest walls in the game. It was tailor-made to be nigh impenetrable for a litany of otherwise dangerous Pokemon. In addition to excellent pure ground typing alongside monstrous HP and defense stats, Hippowdon was blessed with instant recovery and slack off, allowing it to stick around throughout a game and counter threats repeatedly. Nothing like making Choice Band Tyranitar look like no threat at all. It wasn't unable to damage the opponent either. It had many tools for further punishing opposing teams that already struggled to break it. It usually didn't utilize direct damage, but not because it was weak. Its stab Earthquake was quite strong for a defensive Pokemon, as its base attack was higher than Swampert's. This also let it chip switch-ins like Breloom with Ice Fang, if it chose to run it. Speaking of Breloom, Hippowdon was so tanky on the physical side that Breloom's Seed Bomb wouldn't 2-hit KO it. It also survived Lucario's Swords Dance and Life Orb boosted close combat, which was ludicrous. And even more so, Hippowdon survived a twice Dragon Dance boosted super effective waterfall from Gyarados. Absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, back to the damage Hippowdon dished out. It easily supported its team with Stealth Rock, but so did a lot of Pokemon. What made Hippowdon so tough to deal with was that it stacked even more passive damage on top of those rocks, completely effortlessly by virtue of its Sand Stream, meaning as soon as it hit the field, the opposing team was on a timer. And since Hippowdon was often a lead, this tended to mean right from turn 1. Throw in Roar, which it often used as its last move, and many teams could get worn down uncomfortably quickly. Hippowdon being able to summon sand was huge for stall teams, as they no longer had to use Tyranitar for its sand, as well as another physical wall. They could simply just use Hippowdon. As such, Hippowdon became an iconic stall staple. It struck fear in battlers' hearts as soon as they saw it in the lead position. The timer for breaking Hippowdon ticked even faster when it was part of a stall core thanks to the spikes it was supported by, which made its roar even more threatening. Hippowdon wasn't completely impenetrable, of course. Its low special defense was often preyed upon. That is until it started using a specially defensive set. It lost the ability to devour every physical attack under the sun, but it didn't need investment to be a great physical wall. It still countered physical Tyranitar with ease. The upsides were absolutely massive. Suddenly, Hippowdon was easily countering some of the most dangerous special attacks in the tier. It also made it a more complete Tyranitar counter, as Surprise Ice Beams now simply bounced off of it. Specially defensive Hippowdon originated as a result of lead Machamp, believe it or not. Lead Heatran started shifting over to Specs Overheat in response to Champ, and this would also blow away physically defensive Hippowdon. But with special defense investment, Hippowdon would eat up the overheat. In response, it could get up rocks safely on the first turn before switching to its teammate Blissey. Specs Heatran wasn't a threat in and of itself with Blissey around, but Hippowdon didn't want to be switching out of it for fear of dying on the first turn, only to have Shukaberry Heatran get Stealth Rock completely free. This change to how Hippowdon was used was huge in allowing Stall to combat the shift in offense that took place around the times of the Latias and Salamence bans. It took away the weapon of not just Specs Tran, but many other emerging stall-breaking threats. It completely countered Wish and substitute variants of Calm Mind Jirachi that would easily defeat Blissey. It utterly sat on substitute Pain Split Gengar. It even countered Mixed Dragonite, a Pokemon previously thought to be uncounterable, and sat on the similarly feared Mixed Flygon even more easily. The ability to hard counter these dangerous monsters was absolutely incredible, but specially defensive Hippowdon's utility extended far beyond that which it hard countered. Its ability to take so many hits in a pinch made it absolutely nightmarish for offense to deal with. Previously, it feared a one-hit KO from Mixed Infernape's Life Orb Grass Knot. Now it shrugged the head off with health to spare. Scarf Rotom Wash struggled to 2-hit KO it with Hydro Pump. While it would be a bit of a stretch to call Hippowdon a Heat Round counter, it could take 2 Fire Blasts even with Stealth Rock canceling its leftovers recovery, meaning it made a great check. It even survived Empoleon's Hydro Pump, allowing it to KO it back with Earthquake in a pinch, and it was seen stalling out Celebi's Leaf Storm on multiple occasions. This increased utility led Hippowdon to see more use on not just stall, but also more balanced and offensive teams. It gave them the freedom to use offensive threats like like Life Orb Aerodactyl, since they could fall back on Hippowdon as a hard counter to opposing offensive Pokemon that would threaten them, such as offensive Zapdos and Scarflagon, which was incredible. With Wish Support from Jirachi further accentuating its already excellent longevity, Hippowdon was more unbreakable than ever. Overall, Hippowdon was one of the best walls and support Pokemon around, and as a result was an incredible definitive place of the Diamond and Pearl OU metagame. The inevitable comparisons to Tyranitar certainly didn't help Hippowdon out in VGC, where its inability to be a more proactive teammate meant that it was frequently passed over. Hippowdon's biggest niche was that it was the slowest weather inducer in the game, meaning it would reliably set its weather up on turn 1 and was functional in Trick Room. However, the support options that made it so potent in singles, such as Slack Off and Stealth Rock, were much less useful in doubles, especially when compared to the power and coverage Tyranitar brought to the table. Nevertheless, there were certain moments where Hippowdon left its mark. In fact, Hippowdon got a silver medal at the first ever VGC Worlds in 2009, where Tasuku Mano placed second with the Hippowdon team. Unfortunately, any information about his Hippowdon has been lost to the shifting sands. We know that the rest of his team relied on Sunny Day and Heatwave, and to make things even stranger, he had a Shedinja on his team, possibly the mon with the worst synergy with Hippowdon in the game. Maybe he purely used it to reset the weather against common rain teams of the day. Keep in mind that in Gen 4, the only non-restricted auto weather belonged to Hippowdon, Tyranitar, and Abomasnow. Either way, this was Hippowdon's long notable VGC performance for a long time, as it sank in the shadow of Tyranitar and other more prominent weather setters with the advent of Gen 5. Hippowdon wasn't too common in the early stages of Black and White. Tyranitar was the preferred stand setter for its special defense boost that helped to combat the ever-present Draco Meters and rain that were flying around, while other physical walls were generally more useful, specifically those that could take the tier-defining Sand Rush Excadrill Swords Dance boosted Earthquake, meaning Gliscor, Skarmory, Tangrowth, and Unaware Quagsire. Hippowdon saw some sparing use on early Sandstall teams, then was left alone for a while until the end of the Excadrill Thundurus metagame, where it popped up as a more longevity-focused sand setter, which allowed it to maintain the sand more easily for its own partner, Excadrill. Being able to check the dangerous Sand Force Landorus Incarnate was excellent as well, since that had begun to use Smackdown and Hidden Power Ice to blow past the other common physical walls. Hippowdon had none of that. Sadly, Excadrill was banned shortly afterwards alongside Thundurus. However, after another brief intermission during which Deoxys Speed was banned as well, Hippowdon came roaring back with a vengeance, as more players realized just how amazing its advantages over Tyranitar were. Being the only weather setter with a reliable recovery move was absolutely amazing. Plus, where Tyranitar could sometimes struggle against Sun and Rain, Hippowdon utterly dominated them. It also didn't care about Dugtrio one bit. This meant it absolutely ruined Sun teams, and with especially defensive spread, it was a great check to the Volcarona they packed as well. Against Rain, Hippowdon made full use of its huge bulk and longevity to aggressively switch in to slash off huge chunks of Politoed and Tentacruel's health, not minding taking a stray Scald or even a burn while replacing the Rain with sand over and over again. It wear them down while healing off their dinky hits with ease, making it easy to outlast them in the weather war. Hippowdon was great against opposing sand too. Countering Landorus was as terrific as ever, and it sat on the increasingly popular Alakazam. To the surprise of many, it could also shrug off a Specs Latios Draco Meteor in a pinch. It was just incredibly hard to kill. Furthermore, Hippowdon's sand was more than just a weapon against opposing weather. It facilitated its own teammates, activating devastating abilities like Landorus' Sand Force and Acrobatics Flying Gem Gliscor's Sand Veil. Hail was a rare playstyle, but Abomasnow's Stealth Rock weakness and lack of a reliable recovery meant it had an even tougher time keeping up with its fellow 4th generation weather setter. Hippowdon's huge bulk was also excellent in dealing with common threats found on weatherless teams like Dragonite and Terrakion. Put simply, no matter the matchup, Hippowdon was incredibly reliable. As a result, various styles of Hippowdon sand popped up and established themselves as among the most dominant playstyles in the metagame. It was preferred to Tyranitar by many top players. Of course, one didn't necessarily have to choose between Hippowdon and Tyranitar, as a few teams managed to successfully fit both, making it nearly impossible for Rain and Sun to win. Hippowdon was one of the best, most definitive, and iconic Pokemon for the latter half of Black and White 1, and despite a massive influx of power creep, it continued to act as a cornerstone of defensive teams, but it also began seeing use on sand offense teams as well. Bolstering their defensive security was incredible utility for offensive Pokemon like Terrakion and Keldeo to fall back on. Hippowdon stall and Hippowdon offense were equally representative of the metagame for quite a while, even when monsters like Genesect and Tornadus Therian were fueling rain teams to terrifying new heights. Hippowdon persevered, standing firm constantly, cutting the rain off without fearing their beloved Doug Trio. Hippowdon's presence in the metagame continued after the previously mentioned Pokemon were banned, and it was absolutely iconic in the tier. Sadly, Hippowdon's iconic status did not last. It didn't instantly become unviable or stop getting used or anything. It just gradually became less prominent as the metagame became harsher towards it. Hippowdon didn't match up well against the direction sand teams began to focus on, that being the combination of hazard stacking and the psychics Latios, Alakazam, and Reuniclus. Tyranitar became the preferred sandstorm setter for its ability to pursue them. Latios in particular was discovered to be nearly impossible to handle if it got to spam Draco Meteor all game without getting trapped. The nerfing of some teams and the unbanning of Extra were blows to Hippowdon as well. That said, while its usage dropped from metagame staple to more of a niche choice, Hippowdon never stopped being viable. Its strengths were excellent. It was unmatched in shutting Tentacruel down, and several teams still made use of its talents. Overall, Hippowdon had an incredible 5th generation of OU, playing a major part in several facets of the metagame's development. But we are far from done with Gen 5 Hippowdon though. Its lack of use in the early stages of the generation led it to fall to UU, and there it was metagame defining. It was most well known for its ability to facilitate the Excadrill of UU. No, not Drillbur, but rather Stoutland, who effortlessly terrorized entire teams by outrunning everything in the game and hitting quite hard. Its power was accentuated by Hippowdon's rocks and Sandstorm wearing away at the few Pokemon capable of withstanding its hits. In fact, most of the best answers to Stoutland was Hippowdon itself. These teams also often use Spike's Roserade to punish bulky water types and make Stoutland even more impossible to withstand over the course of a long game. Many top players wanted action to be taken off the strength of Stoutland and Permanent Sand alone. However, as it turned out, it just wasn't the facilitation of Stoutland that made Hippowdon so ridiculously overbearing in UU. Though that would have been enough on its own, the fact was that Hippowdon was borderline unkillable for the vast majority of the tier. It easily withstood monstrous physical attackers like Scarf Darmanitan, Choice Band Rhyperior, and Swords Dance Bisharp and Cobalion. It was essentially a physical version of Blissey or Chansey, except it was a lot less passive than those two, as it racked up far more damage between not just Sandstorm shipping nearly the whole metagame, but also its phasing capabilities that dragged in and racked up damage on Pokemon that needed to stay healthy. This was excellent on its own and became blatantly overpowered when paired with something as dangerous as Stoutland. Hippowdon phasing in a Suicune was actually a good thing, because just the Stealth Rock damage, let alone Stealth Rock and Spikes, meant it was one step closer to losing to Stoutland. The natural difficulty in dealing with Stoutland was also greatly exacerbated by the rocks and steels that temporarily fended it off being easily permanently walled by Hippowdon. Thus, Stoutland was essentially battering away at and wearing down his counters completely for free, and would effortlessly outlast them. Sand was by far the single most dominant strategy in the tier. More or less every top player used it. It wasn't even like Sand could be exploited through powerful special attackers. Bulky Aerodactyl was a popular choice to completely shut down would-be threats in Chandelure and Alakazam. The playstyle was more or less perfect all around. It wasn't long until Hippowdon was banned to BL, both for its facilitation of Stoutland and its incredible walling prowess. It eventually moved up to OU proper. As for UU, players still wanted to abuse Stoutland, thus they called upon Eviolite Hippopotas, and wouldn't you know it, before long Sand was banned in its entirety. Finally, Hippowdon even had a solid place in Ubers. It beautifully facilitated Sand Rush Excadrill, one of the metagame's top threats, and it had a major advantage over Tyranitar. It effortlessly switched into Groudon, replacing the Sun with Sand. To be able to so easily instantly force a weather advantage was immense in making Excadrill as threatening as possible, and Hippowdon was able to do so repeatedly thanks to its great longevity and slack off, alleviating any damage sustained, allowing it to outlast Groudon. These factors combined to make Hippowdon excellent in winning the Weather War. Hippowdon also checked several top tier physical threats in a manner similar to the same type Groudon, but with greater longevity. It stopped the dreaded Extreme Killer Arceus in its tracks, it stuffed most Zekrom variants, and it was actually better than Groudon against Ho-Oh, since it could both heal off Sacred Fire burns and didn't power up the Sacred Fire through Sun. All in all, Hippowdon had an absolutely incredible Generation 5 singles career. Gen 5 did see one Hippowdon sighting in VGC, though it's a bit of a strange one. Wolf Glick used Hippowdon on his Worlds 2013 team, which also consisted of a truly odd assortment of Registeel, Gliscor, Magmar, Latios, and Rotom Wash that finished in 25th place. We sent our most diligent reporter and writer of our VGC sections, Epangu, to interview Wolf on the details of this highly specific team, and this is what we got. So there you have it, folks. High praise for the Hippo indeed. Special thanks to Wolf Glick for the information. X and Y was immensely power crept, in large part thanks to Mega Evolutions, but this time Hippowdon Sandstorm was also no longer permanent. However, Hippowdon was as excellent a wall as ever, and once again established itself as an important part of OU. It was one of the very few safe answers to Mega Charizard X, and unlike Landorus Therian, it kept itself healthy with Slack Off. It also made Mega Manectric completely rue its existence and staved off Mega Tyranitar. It could even help its team pivot around a Mega Charizard Y, cutting off the sun that made it so threatening, and even Mega Venusaur as sand would weaken Synthesis, ensuring it stayed at low health. It checked several key non-Megas too, most notably Aegislash, as well as Talonflame, Thundurus, Bisharp, and Excadrill. Speaking of Excadrill, Hippowdon was also excellent because it provided the Sandstorm that allowed Sandrush Excadrill to be both a terrifying sweeper and a revenge killer extraordinaire. In the latter case, facilitating Excadrill's ability to outspeed and destroy the metagame's various dangerous offensive threats like Mega Gardevoir was a case of Hippowdon's ability to keep the metagame in check that extended beyond its own walling ability. Hippowdon Sand was even useful for wearing away a Pokemon neither it nor Excadrill wanted any part of. Even though Greninja, Keldeo, and Azumarill were highly threatening, they would still get chipped. Of course, Hippowdon continued to chip nearly everything with its ever-reliable Stealth Rock. It didn't mind the buff to Fog as rocks had more PP, and Hippowdon had plenty of longevity, so it could simply play the long game, repeatedly coming back in and getting the rocks back up. Rocks were more useful than ever, given the multitude of rock-weak threats in the tier, such as several of the aforementioned, as well as the likes of Kyurem Black and Mega Pinsir, and Hippowdon ensured they went up. Oraz came around, adding several vicious new Megas, and Hippowdon took them on with aplomb. It was one of the best answers to the terrifying Mega Metagross, and completely blanked Mega Lopunny. It had to be careful around Moonblast if not at full health, but it was a solid check to Mega Diancie too, eating up Diamond Storms like nothing, and scaring it out with Earthquake, ensuring that its Stealth Rock wouldn't get permanently blocked by Magic Bounce. This was in conjunction with its previous uses of checking several other top threats, and supporting its team through Stealth Rock, Sand Chip, and facilitation of Sand Rush Excadrill. Hippowdon was one of the most reliable, important defensive pieces of the metagame, its utility on full display on a game-to-game basis. Even with the rise of new threats like Choice Band Tyranitar and Dragon Edge Dragonite, Hippowdon was always there. Even against Pokemon it didn't beat one-on-one like Swords Dance Gliscor and Calm Mind Clefable, Hippowdon could still be annoying thanks to Whirlwind, making them unable to switch in safely and forcing damage elsewhere. For example, despite being walled by these two as well as Skarmory, Ferrothorn, and most water types, Hippowdon could repeatedly drag in Scarf Tyranitar and batter away at it with Stealth Rock. Hippowdon's usage fluctuated as the generation drew on. It wasn't as useful on average when the metagame focused more on bulky spike stacking teams, and its usage dropped from the incredibly prominent status it had during the generation's more offensive phase. However, this was a low in the grand scheme of things, as whenever there were offensive threats abound, Hippowdon was as useful as ever, and thus continued to act as an important backbone for several solid teams. Once again, Hippowdon was an important OU Pokemon in Generation 6. Now, though Hippowdon was an important part of OU throughout the generation, its usage wasn't always the highest. Thus, it was UU as the tier came into existence in XY, and stayed there for quite a bit. It was an excellent Pokemon there, as it was possibly the sturdiest counter to one of the tier's most dangerous threats, Mega Aerodactyl. It was also a great partner for Mega Aerodactyl, who loved the special defense boost it received as a result of Hippowdon Sand. It was also an excellent answer to several other top tier Pokemon such as Crocodile, Jirachi, and Mega Aggron, and helped play around other dangerous threats like Victini and Mienshao. And as always, it chipped away at the opponent with Stealth Rock and Sandstorm. Come Oraz, it got even better. It walled Tyrantrone's monstrous head smashes and was the backbone of popular Sand offense teams, effectively facilitating the terrifying Sand Rush Choice Band Stoutland. However, a few months into Oraz, enough OU players recognized Hippowdon's effectiveness in the tier to bring its usage high enough that it rose out of UU, never once returning. Hippowdon resurfaced from under the shifting sands in 2014 when Alistair Vlade Sandover brought it out of nowhere to take first place at the Perth Regionals. As you all know, the first year of a new region inevitably brings with it a regional dex format, and with it a chance for certain Pokemon to shine in a more niche metagame. In Hippowdon's case, its biggest competition was still there. Tyranitar was still around, and in fact had one of its most successful years. To understand Valde's Hippowdon, we first have to understand Tyranitar. Sand was quite useful in 2014 as a quote-unquote neutral weather to reset against the common setters such as Politoed and Charizard Y. But Charizard wasn't the only Mega that Vlade's Hippo was built for. In fact, it was designed as a buttress to the Mega Pokemon who had dominated the game for most of 2014. Mega Kangaskhan. For a good illustration of why this strategy works so well, look at the next 4 teams after Vlade at Perth. All Mega Kangaskhan teams. Kangaskhan's parental bond made it a devastatingly powerful physical attacker, but Hippowdon's high physical bulk made it one of the few Pokemon who could take Kangaskhan's hits easily. And that's not all. The Rocky Helmet that Vlade gave Hippo let it exploit Kangaskhan's biggest strength, forcing it to take contact damage twice. Hippowdon was a perfect counter to the common Smeargle, Talonflame, Mega Kangaskhan core that was popular later in 2014. The physical attackers struggled to break it, with Talonflame especially suffering against the surfeit of residual damage between Helmet, recoil from its stab, and Sandstorm. Hippowdon Sand would also break Smeargle's Sash, allowing it to dispatch the trio with ease. Less specifically, Hippowdon was well suited to the physically oriented metagame of 2014, which also boasted threats such as Garchomp and Mega Mawile. Its moveset was designed to take advantage of its unique meta position. Slackoff let it stay on the field and virtually solo mons like Talonflame, while Ice Fang secured Hippowdon's position against dragon types like Salamence and Garchomp. Whirlwind let Hippowdon handle Trick Room setters, as Whirlwind's -6 priority is just one stage above Trick Room, meaning Hippowdon will always go before Trick Room and whoosh them out of there. And hey, if Trick Room did go up, Hippos aren't especially known for their speed. Finally, Earthquake was Hippo's requisite stab, but it also had great synergy with Vlade's unique mega choice of Mega Aerodactyl, who was also able to shore up its mediocre defense via the special defense boost of Sandstorm. Vlade's Hippowdon was the only one to make a showing throughout all of 2014. Most players opted for Tyranitar as their sand setter of choice, and it's not hard to see why. Hippowdon was very matchup specific, whereas Tyranitar itself can be a powerful active force in its own right. Mega Kangaskhan usage also dropped off a cliff at Worlds, as players prepared counter strategies and counters to those counter strategies. But Vlade's careful hippopotamus selection is a good example of how a tailored off-meta Pokemon can fit well into the shifting metagame of VGC. Although, funnily enough, Hippowdon didn't even get to play in the finals. Due to corrupted data, Vlade had to use a friend's team instead and managed to come out on top regardless, with Mega Kangaskhan. I guess Kangaskhan is just inevitable. So in a fitting summary of its career, Hippowdon actually had to bow down from the podium even earlier than it should have. Special thanks to Alistair Vlade Sandover for the information. Generation 7 saw Hippowdon fall from OU for the first time. It wasn't that it was bad, far from it, as it still had quite a useful niche. It just didn't match up well against most of the offensive metagame, meaning its walling capabilities were no longer as consistently useful. It did see heavy usage early in the generation, as Mega Metagross was terrorizing the tier, and Hippowdon was one of the few Pokemon capable of staving it off at all. However, Mega Metagross was quickly banned, and Hippowdon struggled to keep up, as it was a physical wall unable to check or slow down two of the most prominent physical attackers, Kartana and Tapu Bulu. Plus, the massive power of Z-moves made even many neutral attacks too difficult for Hippowdon to handle, especially since its Earthquake was weakened against targets like Magearna, Excadrill, and Mega Charizard X, if grassy terrain was in effect. Landorus T was generally preferred. Its grass neutrality and Intimidate meant it could help play around Kartana and Bulu, while Intimidate made it more useful overall, as it slowed down terrifying physical attackers Hippowdon couldn't check, like Mega Mawile, as well as various Z users like Excadrill. Lando was generally more useful overall since it was a fast, capable offensive threat itself. Even its slowest, bulkiest sets were still faster than Mega Mawile and could maintain momentum with U-turn. Now, this is not to say Hippowdon did not have use in OU. It wasn't common, but it certainly had a place. Bulky teams loved its longevity wearing away at the opponent through Stealth Rock and Sandstorm while staying healthy itself. It was one of the most reliable answers to Tapu Koko, which was otherwise well known for irritating teams. Additionally, a brand new set popped up, Fast Hippowdon. It was just your garden variety Hippowdon moveset, but with a lot of speed EVs. Hippowdon was naturally incredibly bulky, and the speed investment turned it into possibly the only truly reliable Mega Mawile check, especially with Rocky Helmet. Unlike Landorus T, Hippowdon was not mortally afraid of Ice Punch, and could stay healthy throughout the game even without leftovers thanks to Slackoff. It wasn't fit for every type of team, but it was a genuine niche that infuriated several tournament players who were counting on their Mawile being unwallable. Once again, Hippowdon had a place in OU. Of course, Hippowdon's lack of high usage meant it did drop to UU once again, and this time it stayed there, despite its occasional OU appearance. Once again, it was an absolutely excellent Pokemon. As before, it was an incredible wall against two of the best, most popular Pokemon in the tier, Crocodile and Mega Aerodactyl. And it also hardwalled UU newcomer Mega Manectric. It sometimes had to watch out for certain Z-moves, but it was also one of the better answers to several other dangerous offensive threats, such as Terrakion and Cobalion. It really only faltered to a boosted Phytenium Terrakion, which was quite rare, given how it would usually vastly preferred Rockium for the likes of Slowbro and Gligar. Even a +2 all-out pummeling from Cobalion wouldn't KO Hippo, and while Hippo's Earthquake wouldn't KO a healthy Cobalion, it would easily put it in range for a faster teammate, usually Hippo's go-to cleanup partner, Mega Aerodactyl. Hippowdon also helped pivot around and help check other monsters like Infernape and Gengar. As always, its sand was excellent at helping deal with several threats it didn't even necessarily check on its own, like Latias, Togekiss, and Suicune, in addition to the aforementioned Infernape. It was especially useful for crippling Mega Venusaur synthesis during its brief tenure in the tier. The sand ship hovering around the opposing team would make it much easier for Hippo's faster teammates to clean up. Hippowdon was one of the most useful, prominent Pokemon in the tier for some time. The metagame was largely centered around the Hippowdon and Empoleon core, which was so effective that much of the viability of offensive Pokemon was determined by their ability to handle it. As always, it was a reliable stealth rocker. Hydreigon attempting to switch in and defog would be punished by Toxic, allowing Hippowdon to outlast it even more easily. Toxic was also effective in crippling many other would-be threatening switch-ins, such as Latias and Suicune. Overall, in the first generation, where Hippowdon actually remained in UU, it was a fantastic, defining Pokemon. Hippowdon was fairly popular in the early stages of Sword and Shield. It was the one bulky ground type in the tier that both supported and checked Excadrill, which gave it a unique, important advantage over fellow grounds Seismitoad and Rhyperior. However, many players liked using Tyranitar for sand thanks to its ability to handle Dragapult, and many players liked Seismitoad as their ground to save off the mighty Dracovish. Thus, while Hippowdon wasn't uncommon, it wasn't common enough to truly be OU. As a result, when the first iteration of the UU metagame came around, Hippowdon was part of the tier. It was quite popular early on, as once again, it was one of the few ground-type stealth rockers, as well as generally being nigh unkillable for much of the tier. However, its usage slightly dwindled with the release of Home. Hippowdon fit best on defensive teams with bulky Pokemon like Umbreon and Reuniclus, which tended to struggle with certain wall breakers like Pangoro and Toxicroak that Hippowdon shut down hard. Hippowdon's defensive reach was limited, as much of the metagame revolved around Milotic, and most Pokemon that beat Milotic were grass types like Serena and Roserade, and other waters like Vaporeon. So Hippowdon wasn't unkillable for huge swaths of teams as it had been in the past. It also competed with Rhyperior, who was more threatening in return, especially with more Pokemon not being affected by Stealth Rock, thanks to the addition of heavy-duty boots. However, the things Hippowdon did check were important targets Rhyperior wasn't going to be handling. In addition to the aforementioned fighting types, it also checked Lucario and Surfetch'd, as well as several dangerous non-fighters in Haxorus and Rhyperior. Generally, physically defensive Hippowdon was more reliable for the teams it was on, but it had some flexibility in this department, being able to use a specially defensive spread instead. It was team dependent, as it wasn't going to be checking those powerful physical threats anymore, but it gained the ability to thwart the terrifying Chandelure and other threats such as Heliolisk, Vikavolt, and Noivern. It was a solid Pokemon, but once again, it was called back up to OU, which brings us to its place in the tier during the Isle of Armor. Hippowdon began seeing heavy OU usage with its physically defensive sets, allowing it to reliably answer Excadrill, Zeraora, and most importantly, the newly released Libero Cinderace. It was the only reliable counter to the bunny. With Rocky Helmet as the item, Hippowdon punished Excadrill's rapid spin attempts before putting rocks right back up, as well as damaging Cinderace attempting to U-turn. So if Cinderace wanted to chip away at Hippowdon, it would get chipped itself. Slackoff's longevity made Hippowdon both a consistent sponge of Cinderace's Pyro Balls, as well as a reliable stealth rocker. It would ruin any defog attempts from Mandibuzz with Toxic. After some time, Cinderace was banned. Turns out it wasn't healthy for Hippowdon to be the only thing that could safely take it on. The metagame's offensive threats went in new directions, and Hippowdon adapted with a specially defensive set. It completely sat on Aegislash and Dragapult, the latter of which had begun dropping Will-O-Wisp in favor of the Volcarona checking Thunderwave. Speaking of Volcarona, specially defensive Hippowdon completely sat on that too. Some players even ran Rock Slide for the extra security, and even with special defense investment, Hippowdon didn't lose effectiveness in its main role. It was still a great answer to Excadrill and Zeraora. Then came the Crown Tundra, and with it an enormous tier shift that dropped Hippowdon back to UU, and it quickly became the single most important defensive Pokemon around, holding the tier together against a variety of threats that had also dropped in Victini, Volcarona, Blacephalon, Aegislash, and Zeraora, as well as old UU staples like Lycanroc Dusk and Terrakion. Hippowdon was also excellent because in addition to this incredible defensive support, it once again set up Sand for a terrifying Sand Rush sweeper. This time around, it enabled Dracozolt to effectively toss around fully powered Bolt Beaks. It was a great counter to opposing Dracozolt as well. Even after the early bans of Blacephalon and Dracozolt, Hippowdon remained the tier's best defensive Pokemon. It made for a particularly infuriating, unkillable defensive core alongside Celesteela. After some time, Hippowdon moved back up to OU once more, and its departure was a huge blow for UU. Not long after, Volcarona and Aegislash were banned because they were so much more difficult to handle without Hippowdon around. Hippowdon moving back up to OU was a result of players discovering its specially defensive Boots set. This allowed it to reliably counter several top-tier offensive Pokemon, even in the face of spikes. It shut down newcomers Galarian Soul King, Tapu Koko, and all forms of Zapdos, as well as continuing to handle Dragapult, Volcarona, and Zeraora. It wasn't a hard counter to Nidoking and Heatran, but it would check them nicely in a pinch. Hippowdon also brought its UU dynamic with Dracozolt over to OU. It would support the Dracozolt on its own team while countering the Dracozolt on the opponents, and physically defensive sets are still good options to help hold off the likes of Melmetal and Garchomp. Once again, Hippowdon continues to stand strong in OU, same as it ever was. And finally, to cap off Hippowdon's random string of one VGC appearance per generation, we have the first ever official event of VGC 2020, Bochum Regionals, where Jonathan Marston managed to take Hippowdon to a 6th place finish on a team sporting Dragapult, Chandelure, Lapras, Indeedee, and of course, Excadrill. Well, I say of course, but this is actually the first Hippo and Sandrush pairing we've seen in VGC. The reason for that is simple. If you were pairing a Sandrushmon with a Sand Center, Tyranitar was frequently the better option for its better offensive pressure and synergy. Stab, Rock Slide, and high horsepower was hard to deal with as VGC's version of Edgequake. However, despite sharing a ground typing with Excadrill, Hippowdon actually has fewer shared weaknesses with the Molt than Tyranitar does, as Excadrill's steel typing leaves it vulnerable to the same fighting and ground moves that can hit Tyranitar hard. Now, is Tyranitar almost always better? Yes. Does Hippowdon have some niches going for it? Also yes. In any case, Jonathan took advantage of the format's early stage and took the Hippo to its first major appearance of VGC 2020. Regrettably, it would also be Hippowdon's last major placing, as it almost immediately fell out of the meta in favor of, you guessed it, Tyranitar. Even further down the road, Sand fell out of the meta completely, and so Hippowdon withdrew once more, and having made its requisite appearance for the generation, to slumber again. And that's it. So how good was Hippowdon actually? Well, it is a pillar and a symbol of both Sandstorm and defense. Hippowdon has been an important part of OU in every generation it's been in. It has facilitated Stoutland in UU and walled Arceus in Ubers. It's been tremendous nearly every time it's been in UU, and even getting outright banned from the tier its first time around. Whenever it's dropped out of OU, it has almost always come back as battlers realize just how incredible it is against the top tiers, no matter what they are. Even the one time it stayed in UU, it still found an important niche in OU for its ability to wall the single most threatening Pokemon in the tier. And as for VGC, sure, Tyranitar has overshadowed it 99% of the time, but the few times it has appeared, and by few I mean literally once a generation, it's been in top 8 every time. So that has to be something, right? Overall, Hippowdon has reigned impressively throughout its competitive history. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Hippowdon? Would you give it something else to have over Tyranitar and VGC? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.